I met my ex-husband when I was 28. We dated for 2 years and we've been married for 5 years when he disclosed to me that he needed to transition into a woman. And just for clarity, I am going to refer to the whole 7 years of our courtship as the relationship, even though we were dating for 2 years and then married for 5. I remember the night he came out. Jack had been complaining for several years that I hadn't been giving him enough love and attention. No matter how much I tried, it was never enough. That night, I had just put our son to bed. Jack and I watched a TV show, something I didn't really want to do that night, but I did for Jack. After the TV show finished, he gave me a letter telling me that he was transgender and wished to become a woman. He said he had felt it for a couple of weeks at that time. He spoke about his eagerness to start cross-sex hormones because he wanted to change his body shape and grow breasts. He talked about how this was the answer he had been seeking all his life. My stomach sank. I didn't really understand what transgender meant at the time. I had never heard of terms such as cross-sex hormones, top surgery, and bottom surgery. My first question to Jack was, "What's going to happen to us?" He said nothing would change. But I knew at that moment our marriage was over. I was scared that he was going to coerce me into acts that I didn't want to do. I thought about what this meant for our son and how it would impact him, something Jack clearly didn't think about. Jack didn't give me 24 hours to digest the news before he started changing his appearance. The very next day, I came home from work to find him wearing female clothes, new hairdo, painted nails, body hair all removed, eyebrows sculptured, and new eyelash extensions. He also smelled of women's perfume. A few days later, he rehashed his entire wardrobe with women's clothes. I found his silicone breasts, lacy underwear, and bras in the house. It wasn't just the physical changes. It was his personality too. He said I should try being intimate with him to see if I like it. There were endless arguments and demands for my support and validation. When he didn't get the validation he wanted from me, he sought comfort elsewhere, namely the internet. Initially, when he came out, he said he had gender dysphoria, right? A few weeks later, I asked him about it because I went and Googled the definition. I found that gender dysphoria is something you had to have felt for at least 6 months. A low bar, but Jack didn't even have that at the time. So, by his own admission, he had only experienced gender confliction for only a few weeks at that point. When I asked him about this, his response was that he didn't have gender dysphoria after all. He was simply transgender. Apparently, people can be transgender without having gender dysphoria, something I still don't understand to this date. It didn't matter to him what I felt or how our son might be impacted by all of this. All that mattered was that he wanted to become a woman. It didn't take me long to end the marriage, especially after Jack physically assaulted me for not affirming him. My son and I moved out of the family home and couch surfed for a few months. After a couple of months of couch surfing, we found a rental to call our home. Our legal proceedings are still ongoing with our separation. Initially, it took several attempts and a warning letter before my ex even responded to my lawyer's letters. We are currently negotiating the splitting of the assets. I'm learning about Australia's family law as I go through this process. By no means I'm an expert, but I will share what I have learned so far. In Australia, we can't go straight to court. We have to follow what's called a pre-action procedure and demonstrate we have done everything reasonably possible to resolve matters outside of court. So this means we have to demonstrate that we've tried negotiating and we've tried mediating before we can file for a court hearing. When it comes to financial matters, the way the asset pool is determined can be heavily biased. The asset pool is the sum of our joint assets and our individual assets when the agreement is reached. Income is not considered an asset, it's the savings. And in my case, my ex has a very high income, but he has very bad spending habits, so he has no savings. So even though he has a very high income, he has very minimal assets to show for it. I also speculate based on the information that I've seen from my ex that he's not fully forthcoming with his full range of individual assets. To confirm my speculation, I'd have to commission specialists like a forensic accountant or a forensic portfolio analyst. And these things involve a lot of money. So the problem with the law at the moment in Australia is that when people hide or lie about their assets, there is little to no consequences. He's undervaluing his assets and overvaluing my assets. By doing these things, it will tilt the split in his favour. When I married him, I already had some assets, like a house, a car, decent amount of savings. When he came into the marriage, he had nothing. No car, no property, no savings. When we bought our matrimonial house, despite his high income, he said he didn't have any savings. So I paid the full house deposit. I've shared the loan repayments with him equally since. There's a short 7-month period that I was on maternity leave and I didn't contribute at that time because I had to go unpaid. And I paid for almost all the furniture we had in our matrimonial house. Yet he claimed that he contributed more, which is a lie. In spite of all that I've contributed and also the assets that I brought in, he is asking to split that in half, which means a lot of what I brought in, a little bit of what he brought in, and then he wants to divide that by 2. So it's not quite fair for me. Sometimes the attitude is that they'd rather spend it and get rid of it than let your ex-spouse have it. So then they start, selling off their assets or spending money or selling off their shares or things like that. And there are no consequences. You just have to write it off and say, oh, well, it's gone now. He's also accumulated some debt, which also gets added to the calculation because it's your assets less liabilities is what's left over. Because of the large costs associated with court proceedings and the legal representation, people are often forced to settle out of court, even if the outcome is unfair. Additionally, due to gender ideology and his transgender identity, I have to be very, very careful because anything I say or do can be twisted to say that I'm discriminating against his gender identity. I am compelled to refer to him using his female name and pronouns, so he can't accuse me of discrimination and thereby assassinate my character and then tilt the matter in his favour. I have a young son, so Australia provides some government subsidies for childcare based on income, and when I separated, my income is a lot less than my ex, so I started receiving some assistance with childcare as a single mum. This helps immensely because childcare costs without that subsidy it's not financially viable for most people to work. With children and custody arrangements, the law puts a very heavy emphasis on having a meaningful relationship with both parents and disregards many abusive behaviours, especially when they are non-physical abuse like verbal abuse, emotional abuse, mental and financial abuse. So, for example, in my case, I have a DVO against my ex because he physically assaulted me. However, the law doesn't extend that protection to our child because the ex only attacked me and not the child. The law doesn't acknowledge the potential danger to the child due to the violent nature of a person until an attack has already occurred. With regard to custody, the fact that he was violent towards me has no bearing. The custody arrangement is currently settled between my ex and I, and we settled out of court. We have a routine that works. Things may change in the future as our child grows older, but I am committed to putting our child's needs first, and I will give more weight to the child's preferences as he gets older. I have since connected with a few other trans widows within Australia and overseas. It's remarkable how similar all our stories are. Some of the common themes that I've noticed through sharing our experiences are: it's almost always when something big happens in the relationship where the man's no longer in the center of attention, that's when these inner women come out. So, for example, common themes are having a child, losing a job, or even sometimes the wife receiving some serious medical diagnosis. They all seem to have narcissistic personality traits, very selfish. As I look back on our relationship, I realize he hardly tried to improve our relationship or our lives as a family. His decisions were always purely based on his self-satisfaction. They all seem to be on the autism spectrum. It's another thing that appears to be quite common. They are perpetrators of emotional and mental abuse. Some of them even escalate to physical violence, like it did in my case. Another interesting thing that we all noticed is that most of these men work in IT or are at least very, very tech savvy. And often they don't have many, if any, real life friends. So they tend to have these secret online lives, and they consume porn and they're into anime. I can sense his hate towards me, but it is difficult to explain in words. It's not always what he says. Sometimes it's what he doesn't say, or the way he says it, or sometimes it's just the way he looks at me. Despite having agreed to many of his whims, and not just in the face of the separation but all through our relationship, he continues to make things harder for me. And one way he's done this for a long time is by blaming all undesirable outcomes on me. He blames me for the separation. I should mention that I am a woman of colour and my ex is Caucasian. It has crossed my mind whether he held some resentment towards this. And I say this because in the early years of our relationship, we discussed race and sex. My ex would vehemently argue that there is no such thing as racism and sexism in the Western world. He would say that people or the media put too much emphasis to create further division. If I mentioned any incident that might be perceived as possibly having racist or sexist elements, he would very quickly invalidate my view, saying that I'm being too sensitive and overreacting. So I stopped talking to him about those issues for a while, and that worked. But now that he identifies as a woman, he claims transgender people are so oppressed and so discriminated against. Just makes me wonder if he was jealous that I had what he perceived as some sort of social oppression points by being a woman of colour, and he had none by being a white man. Another thing I noticed looking back is he rarely expressed excitement when I was pregnant and didn't engage in discussions or decision making about the birth. He wasn't very supportive when I struggled with postpartum depression. In fact, he expressed his frustration with me often. He didn't want to discuss the well-being or hear my concerns about our son after he was born. And when I tried to talk about these things, he got very annoyed and sometimes even angry at me. It just makes me wonder what he wants from me and why he appeared to have disliked me even when we were married still. I have left him now. I have agreed to his custody arrangement. I've given him freedom to do what he wants, and yet he won't agree to a fair financial settlement. He wants to be called mummy. He wants to take that away from me. How far will he go to erase and replace me? What does he want? I keep wondering, what does he want from me? What does he want my womb? Will he be satisfied then? My son, he's quite young still, but he has always been very excited to spend time with his father. Even when he was a baby, and back when my ex and I were still married, our son would wiggle and jump around in excitement when Dad came home from work. I've noticed during the early days of the separation, he was still quite enthusiastic to visit his dad. But recently, our son has been a little less enthusiastic about it. For example, he delays getting ready to go and visit his dad. He gets quite upset at the handover times and asks me not to leave. I wonder how his father's transformation is affecting him. The separation is probably it's difficult enough on young children, but on top of that, there's another layer. His father's not just separated, but also changing, transforming into this other person. The confusion it must create, it's just heartbreaking. There are no long-term studies done of children of transitioning parents, so we just don't have any idea about the impacts this has on children. We just don't have the data. Less than 6 months after our separation, my ex found a new partner who is also a trans-identifying male. They are cohabitating in our matrimonial house, which he is refusing to split fairly. My ex did voluntarily disclose the information that he now has a new partner who is trans. However, he refuses to reveal the full name of the new partner. Unfortunately, it is entirely legal in Australia to withhold this information, and there is nothing I can do. Unless I can prove that my child is in danger or something has happened, which is very difficult because as a mother, as a parent, you want to prevent these things from happening, not waiting for something to happen and then take action. I say this not because I'm saying that this person is dangerous or violent. I just don't know. It's a funny one. I understand that there's the need for privacy and everything, but when it does involve a young child spending overnight, as a parent, I feel like it's my duty to know who my child is spending time with. I'm afraid to push it because of the repercussions associated with the gender ideology and the, potential for discrimination. At the end of the day, it doesn't have anything to do with the gender ideology. I would have asked the same question had it been a male or a female. It doesn't matter. So I do have to walk this path very carefully because I don't want to be accused of discrimination, and at the end of the day it isn't. I'm just trying to look out for my child. I suspected he had ADHD about halfway through our relationship. I noticed he had trouble concentrating on tasks that he didn't find interesting or enjoyable to him. And he over-concentrated on tasks that interested him, like his hobbies, for example. And speaking of hobbies, they changed quite a lot. He would engage in a new hobby very, very intensely for a period of time, so sometimes months, sometimes even a few years, and then lose interest and abandon entirely. He did get formally diagnosed after some years, and this makes me wonder sometimes if ADHD made him more susceptible to the current transgender fad. He's investing intensely like he has with other hobbies. I guess only time will tell if this is indeed a fad or not for him. I am concerned about what my son will make of all this as he gets older. My fear is that he will be unduly influenced by his father. However, I am determined to do the best that I can to guide him in the right direction. Jack put me down regularly. He called me crazy and bigoted. He had mood swings, especially anger when I didn't affirm him. He demanded I engage in circular arguments about his gender identity. He threatened to unalive himself on more than one occasion, saying his only options were to live as a woman or not live at all. To this day, Jack firmly believes that he has done nothing wrong and that he has contributed nothing to our separation. According to him, the separation is entirely my fault, and he harbors a lot of anger towards me over that. Looking back with the knowledge I have now, I don't recall a time he has taken responsibility for his negative, hurtful actions or even apologized. Over time, he had me convinced that I was mentally unstable and too far damaged to be fixed. It took me months after the separation to see that this was mental and emotional abuse. I still suffer mental trauma from being put down and invalidated so often during my relationship with Jack. It's not easy being a single mother. I juggle my career and caring for a toddler all by myself. Financially, I'm significantly worse off. He drained our accounts with his erratic spending, especially towards the end of our relationship. And divorce is very expensive, especially when it involves a person with narcissistic traits. Like many other women who've been in my situation, of course I tried therapy, couples and individual. All the mental health professionals we saw were all too happy to affirm him. What was needed from me was acceptance and tolerance. I really struggled to find a therapist who wasn't wrapped up in the gender ideology. But I did find one eventually, and she sees past the gender ideology and recognizes my ex's actions for what they are. From my personal experience, is not only that there is a lack of support for trans widows in the liberal feminist community, but rather we are demonized for not following the gender ideology along with our exes. I suspect they view our ex-spouses as these brave heroes and thus us as villains for simply not wanting to continue our relationships. If it was, say, like gambling or infidelity or even substance abuse, people would try to help the affected women because as a society it is widely accepted that those things are bad and that they have very real, very negative impacts to those around. Social narrative is that transgender people are constantly targeted, so unjustly treated, denied even the most basic human rights, such as, access to food or shelter or clean water. And the narrative is even that they're killed regularly. When you look into it, none of these things are true. This perceived injustice makes anybody who identifies as transgender almost immune to normal social rules and standards that the rest of us exist within. So when gambling, infidelity, or substance abuse are done, they're done by a person, just a mere person. When it comes to changing sex, it's done by a special person. By extension of that, they must receive whatever he or she wants. As much as they'd like to think that, they don't exist in a vacuum with just themselves. They did marry us. In my case, we do have a child, a decision we made together, and it is important to consider those things when people choose to follow big life-changing decisions such as the gender ideology. I'm very lucky that I have a very good support system. I have met some new friends online and in real life. My family is 100% supportive of me and acknowledges the difficulties that have been created by my ex. Talking and connecting with people who are grounded in reality has been really helpful. It really improves my mental health and mental stability. I would like to say to someone who may be in a similar situation as me that it's okay to leave. Anecdotal evidence from other trans widow communities suggests that it won't get better if you can. Protect yourself and your children. Nobody deserves to be used and abused mentally, physically, emotionally, financially or sexually. Lawmakers, I urge you to see the material reality. Humans cannot change sex. Presenting as the opposite sex shouldn't grant them privileges above and beyond other people. I wish the lawmakers and media editors recognize the destruction it causes families. If there is abusive behavior within these relationships, they need to be suitably punished, not be given a free pass just because they're transgender. Often the partners and children of adult transitioners are ignored. We need better mental health services that don't center around gender ideology. So next time you hear of an adult person coming out as transgender, please think of their partners and children and how they might be impacted, and how many lives are turned upside down by selfish choices of one person.